We continue now at the top of Daf Memches Amud Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 48b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara asked, how do we know that a carbon chatas is slaughtered in the north side of the Azara? And the Gemara said the source is from the carbonola. Carbon chatas is compared to carbonola. Just like carbonola is slaughtered in the north of the Azara, so too carbon chatas is slaughtered in the north of the Azara. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara said there are actually two psukim which compare the carbon chatas to the carbonola. And because it's repeated, that's how we know that this is absolutely required, that if it is not slaughtered in the north of the Azara, it is disqualified. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought the pasuk which says, "V'shachat oso b'mekom asher yishchat es ha'ola lefnei Hashem chatasu." That's a comparison to carbonola, that it's slaughtered in the same place as the carbonola in the north of the Azara. And the Brisa now continues and says, "V'chi mikanat olam," is it learned from here? V'alo kvar nemer, doesn't it already say, "B'mekom asher tishachet ha'ola tishachet hachatos"? It says, in the place where the ola is slaughtered, that's where the chatos will be slaughtered. The same basic idea. Why is it repeated? Halama yotza. So why is it again that you have this pasuk a second time? Likvoa lo makom shimlo shachta b'tzafon. It's to establish a place that if it's not slaughtered in the north, possible it is disqualified. And Rashi explains, "V'chimikan sarech l'lamed l'zeh b'fnei atzmo." Do you have to learn this specific carbon chatos independently? V'alo kol hachatos b'chlal toras hachatos. Aren't all chatos included in the law of chatos? B'makom asher tishachet ola, where the pasuk says you slaughter in the same place as the ola. And so the Brisa said, "L'kvoa l'shanos olav la'akev kivua b'kach." We're repeating it in order to say it's ma'akev, in order to say that it is required. And the Gemara continues and asks, "Ata omer lekach yotza." You're saying the reason why it's singled out over here by this particular carbon chatos, this pasuk that was quoted on the previous summit, is talking specifically about the chatos that's brought by the king. So you're saying the reason why is just a repetition to say it's required. Oh, eino ela, but maybe the reason why it's specified over here by this again, the chatos of the nasi, is because shezeh ton safon vein acher ton safon. Maybe only this one requires the north, and it's not true by other carbon chatos. Talmud lomar, the pasuk says, "V'shachat as hachatos b'makom ha'ola." It says that you're going to slaughter the carbon chatos in the place of the ola. Zebona av l'chol chatos. This teaches a rule for all carbon chatos sheyehu to uno safon, that they require to be slaughtered in the north. And Rashi explains, "Oeno bala akev." Maybe the reason why it's singled out by the sawyer of the nasi is not to say that it's a requirement. Ela lichtov bo oso, to have a miuta. Maybe the oso is actually an exclusion. Ulalamed, it's to teach zeb b'tzafon, that this one is slaughtered in the north. Ve'ein a sawyer acher b'tzafon, and other kinds of goat chatoses are not in the north. Could go in sawyer Yom Kippurim, for example, like the goat that's brought on Yom Kippur, useirei avodas kochavim, or the sawyer, the goat that's brought for the sin of avodah zara. V'shel musve hamoados, or let's say on the holidays, the carbon musaf. Umani mekayim tishachet hachatos. And what am I going to do with the pasuk of tishachet hachatos that says that the chatos is slaughtered in the same place as the ola? Maybe that's b'shar behemos. Maybe that's by other animals. Chutz miseirim, with the exception of goats. The oso ksiv lemutinu. You have the oso to exclude goats, but by all other animals, again, we learn out from the general pasuk by carbon chatos that it has to be in the north, and we learn from this oso that it applies only by this goat, the sawyer of the nasi, but not by other chatoses that are brought from seirim. Talmud lomar, the pasuk says b'seiras yochid. The pasuk says by the sawyer brought by the individual. V'shachat es achatos. It says over there v'shachat es achatos. The havalei lemichta v'shachat osa. It should have just said v'shachat osa. It doesn't have to say v'shachat es achatos. So binyan avu l'chol chatos. So therefore it makes a rule for all chatos. And Rashi notes v'ikuva mio lo nafkalon minei. Now we don't necessarily learn a requirement from here. T'ikol amemar lemitzvah, because you could always say that it's just a lechatchila mitzvah that it should be in the north. Ulahavi seirei chatos. It's just to say that other chatos that are brought from seirim, those should be in the north. The lo lemuutinu may also the sar nasi. You shouldn't exclude them from the oso by the sir nasi. So you're not necessarily learning a requirement, but you'll learn a mitzvah. And Rashi says, "Ulakamon parach." The Gemara later will ask, "Ve'ela oso lamali." So then we're back to the question of what is oso excluding. Again, that's the original pasuk that we brought by the nasi. What is that oso coming to exclude if we're not excluding other kinds of chatos that are brought from seirim? And the Gemara continues and asks, "Eshkechan sar nasi." So now we find a source by the sar brought by the nasi, by the king, bein lemitzvah, bein la'akev, that not only is it a mitzvah lechatchila to be slaughtered in the north, but it's even la'akev, it's even a requirement. And shar chatos nami, when it comes to other carbon chatos, eshkechan lemitzvah. So we do have a source that at least lechatchila it has to be slaughtered in the north. but la'akev min nolan. From where do we know that it's a requirement? And to that the Gemara says d'chsiv b'kisba uchsiv b'seira, because we have it written by kisba, by the sheep, and we have it written by the goat as well. We'll see Rashi in a moment, but that serves as the source for other carbon chatos. But the Gemara then continues and asks the question that Rashi already alluded to, Ela oso lamali, according to that, if nothing is excluded, so what is the oso for? That's the oso by the soyer of the nasi, the soyer of the king. What is it coming to exclude? And the Gemara says to that, Mi boi le l'chidetanya, we need it for what is taught in the following brisa, oso b'tzafon, ve'in soyer nachshon b'tzafon, that is slaughtered in the north, but not the soyer of nachshon. This is talking about the soyer that was brought at the Chanukas HaNesiim by the inauguration of the Mishkan of the Nesiim. That did not need to be in the north. We will note that the Shinui Nuschos takes out the word l'chidetanya, just Mi boi le oso b'tzafon, ve'in soyer nachshon b'tzafon. In any case, that's what it's coming to exclude. It's coming to exclude the soyer of nachshon. And the Gemara continues, the Shinui Nuschos has the girsa here of Titania, as we learned in the following brisa. V'samach yado talks about leaning his hand upon the animal. V'samach yado al rosh hasor, it says he leans his hand on the head of the goat. L'rabo soyer nachshon l'smicha. That comes to include, even the soyer nachshon has this halacha of smicha, of leaning upon the animal. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, L'rabo seirei avodas kochavim l'smicha. It's to include the soyer of avodah zara, that's brought for the communal sin of avodah zara for smicha. That's what this pasuk is coming to include. And so the Gemara says, Sa'al gadai techamina, one might have thought that hoel v'isra smicha, since according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's included for smicha, the soyer of nachshon, so it's rabu nami l'tzafon, so it also should be included in terms of the halacha of north. So kamash malon, that's what the exclusion is coming for, to say the halacha of tzafon does not apply to the soyer of nachshon. And Rashi explains, Shar chatos nami lemitzvah eshkechon, when it comes to other carbon chatos, we find that it's a mitzvah lechatchila, that it should be in the tzafon in the north, mitishachet hachatos. Again, that's from the pasuk of tishachet hachatos, in the same place the ola is slaughtered, that's where the chatos is slaughtered. And the Gemara answered, D'chsib b'kisbo, chsib b'seira. The reason why we know it, that it's la'akev by other carbon chatos, is because it's written by both the sheep and by the goat. B'kulam ksiv b'makom asher yishachet ola. By all of them it says they're slaughtered in the same place as the ola. V'sagile b'seira would have been enough to write it by the seira, by the female goat. V'telef mine kisba lemitzvah, and then you could have learned kisba lemitzvah. You could have learned to the sheep that that's a mitzvah lechatchila. And the Shinuya Nuschos changes it from lemitzvah to le'ikuva, that it's a requirement by the kisba. We would have learned that from the seira. But the point is, v'chi hadar kasve b'kisba, when it again writes it by the sheep, so teneu le'inyan lepnimios v'lesirei haragolim le'ikuva, we can apply that to the inner carbon chatos and to the goats that are brought on the holidays, that again, that there it is a requirement. And then the Gemara said, if all of that is true, so what is the exclusion for? What are we excluding? The Gemara said, ve'ein seir nachshon, we're excluding the goat of nachshon. There you don't have a halacha of tzafon. Seirei chanukas hanesiim, that's talking about the goats that were brought at the inauguration of the Nesiim, when the Nesiim brought those karbonos at the inauguration of the Mishkan, shelo bo al chet. And the idea is that those seirim, they were not brought for a particular sin. And the Gemara says, l'chidetanya de israbi l'smicha, because we do know that the soyer nachshon, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda, was included in the halacha of smicha. V'sal kadaitach l'rebuye nami l'shchita, and so therefore one might have thought to include also for l'shchita b'tzafon, for slaughtering in the north. L'hachi kasev oso l'mute. That's what the oso for is. That's what the oso is for. It's for that exclusion. And again, it said in the pasuk al rosh hasoyer, it says v'samach yadu al rosh hasoyer b'soyer nosiksiv. Now that pasuk is written by the soyer of the nasi, of the king. V'havale limechtav al rosho. It should have just said on its head. It didn't have to say al rosh hasoyer. So that's why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that includes the soyer of nachshon. And according to Rabbi Shimon, that's l'rabo seirei avodas kochavim l'smicha. It includes the goats for the goat for the communal sin of avodah zara for smicha. And Rashi says, mishum dameitinu Rabbi Yehuda l'smicha b'Meseches menachos. Rabbi Yehuda says it's excluded from smicha. He says that in Meseches menachos, mehai de soyer hamishtalech techsiv v'samach Aaron eshteyadav al rosh hasor hachai ton smicha ve'ein seirei avodas kochavim to unin smicha. It's an exclusion learned over there that it says v'samach Aaron. It says that Aaron is going to lean upon the soyer hachai, upon the goat that's alive, and we say that one requires smicha, but the seirei avodas kochavim, they do not require smicha. Rabbi Shimon darash hachai ton smicha bi'Aaron, and Rabbi Shimon he darshans that the animal, the soyer hachai, it requires smicha from Aaron. Ve'ein soyer avodas kochavim ton smicha ba'Aaron. And when it comes to the soyer of avodas avodah zarah, there you don't require that the smicha be through Aaron, ela beziknei ha'eda, just needs to be through the elders of the community, umarbi lemehacha, and it's included from over here. And the Gemara continues and asks, Hanichal Rabbi Yehuda, well, this works according to Rabbi Yehuda, meaning according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says the Sar Nachshon is included for smicha, so then you might have thought that the Sar Nachshon is included for tzafon, and so you need an exclusion, and that's what Oso is coming for. But Rabbi Shimon, but according to Rabbi Shimon, who's already saying that by the Sar of Nachshon there's no smicha, so what do you need the Oso for? Why do you need to exclude it? But the Gemara continues, Amar le Mar Zutra b'rei Rav Tavi l'Ravina, Mar Zutra the son of Rav Tavi, he said to Ravina, well, Rabbi Yehuda minicha, but is it any better according to Rabbi Yehuda? L'maidis Rabbius Rabbi, maybe for whatever was included, meaning the Sar Nachshon's included for smicha, fine, that's included. But umaida lowest Rabbi, but if it wasn't included, meaning when we're talking about safon, so it's not included, what do you need an exclusion for according to Rabbi Yehuda also? V'chitem, and if you're going to say ilo miyate kra, that if not for the exclusion, hava mina teise b'vinyanav, so I would have thought that you should include it as a binyanav. It's a general rule that we find by other chatos. It applies here as well. But if you're going to say that argument, so imkain, if so, smicha gufa teise binyanav, smicha itself you should be able to learn from a binyanav. So ella, rather, you have to say midoros lo gamrin. You don't learn something out from something that's for all generations to the seir of Nachshon, which only took place at the time of the Mishkan. And so hachinami midoros lo gamrin. And so here also, you're not going to learn from something that's for all generations. And so you really don't have a source. You don't have a binyanav in this situation. And so therefore, the Gemara is back to its question, why is it that we need an exclusion? You can't say it's an exclusion for the Sar of Nachshon, because there's no reason that we would have included the halacha of tzafon by the Sar of Nachshon. You don't learn from Doros. And so therefore, the Gemara says, Viela, rather, Oso b'tzafon, the Oso, which is coming again as an exclusion, it's saying over here, in this particular case, the Sar of the Nasi is b'tzafon, ve'ein shochet b'tzafon, but the person doing the slaughtering does not need to be in the north. In other words, the animal needs to be in the north, but not the shochet, not the person who's doing the slaughtering. He can just stretch out his hand and do the slaughtering in that fashion. And Rashi explains, the Oso is coming to exclude, velo shochet b'tzafon, the shochet does not need to be in the north. Ein sarich sheyamod b'tzafon, he doesn't need to stand in the north. Shimrotz, if he wants, omed b'darim, he could stand in the south. Eitz al tzafon, near the north. V'yoshid yada b'tzafon v'yishchot, and then just stretch out his hand to the north and do the shchita in that fashion. And so therefore, again, that's what we're coming to exclude over here, that the shochet does not need to be in the north. But the Gemara continues and asks, how can you say that Oso is teaching us that ein shochet b'tzafon, that the shochet doesn't need to be in the north, but shochet mid Rabbi Achia nafka, but shochet, we have a different pasuk for that. It's learned out from the teaching of Rabbi Achia. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Achia, Omer Rabbi Achia says, v'shachet Oso al yerech ha-mizbeach tzafona, it says he slaughters it north of the Mizbeach. Ma Talmud lomer, why does the pasuk say that? Lafisha motzinu omed b'tzafon umekabel b'tzafon, because we find that a person stands in the north and receives the blood in the north. V'im Bedarom v'kibel b'tzafon, and if he stands in the south and receives the blood in the north, puzzle, that's disqualified. So Yachol av zekein, one might think that that's true also by the shochet, that he has to be in the north. Talmud lomer Oso, the pasuk says again, this pasuk of V'shachet Oso, it says Oso b'tzafon vein hashochet b'tzafon. There it has to be b'tzafon, but the shochet doesn't have to be b'tzafon. The shochet does not have to be in the north, and so therefore we do have another source. So we're back to the question, what do we do with the Oso? What is the Oso excluding when it says again by the soyer of the Nasi, of the king? It says Oso, it seems to be excluding something from the north. And so the Gemara instead says Ela Oso b'tzafon, rather it means that one is in the north. The Ein ben Of b'tzafon, but if you have a bird carbon, that does not need to be slaughtered in the north. The Tanya's will end in a brayso, Yachol Yehei ben Of to and Safon, one might think that a bird needs to be slaughtered in the north. V'dinhu, it's logical, Uma ben Son, if by a sheep, Shelo kava lo kohen, where the kohen is not the one that has to do the slaughtering. Anyone can do the slaughtering by an animal carbon. And kava lo tzafon, yet it's fixed, it's established that it has to be in the north. So ben Of, when it comes to a bird offering, shekava lo kohen, there the way the bird is slaughtered is through malika, through the fingernail, and it has to be a kohen. So ein odin sheyikva lo tzafon, isn't it logical to say that it must be done in the north? Talmud lomar Oso, again the pasuk says Oso, we're excluding the ben Of and saying it does not need to be in the north. But the Gemara continues and says, but mala ben son shekain kava lo kli. Why would we have learned from son to the case of an Of oaf to the case of a bird, but benson is unique because there you have a vessel in order to slaughter the animal, meaning you use a knife to slaughter the animal, and so therefore we never would have even learned out in the first place that the ben oaf is b'tzafon, so we don't need an exclusion for that. And so the Gemara instead says, Ela oso b'tzafon ve'in pesach b'tzafon. Rather, the oso is to say that this animal is slaughtered in the north, but Karban Pesach does not need to be slaughtered in the north. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Yochol Yehei Pesach Ton Safon. One might think Karban Pesach requires north. V'dinhu, it's logical. Uma'ola shekein lo kavalo zman l'shchitaso. If by an ola where there's no fixed time for its slaughtering, kavalo tzafon, but it has to be in the north. So Pesach. So therefore, one could argue Karban Pesach shekavalo zman l'shchitaso, where there's a time to slaughter it. Eino din sheyikvalo tzafon. Isn't it logical to say that safon, that north is needed? Talmud lomer oso. The pasuk says oso. That's what this exclusion is for. But the Gemara says, why would you learn from ola to Pesach? Mala ola shekein kolil. Ola is unique because it's totally burned, so no one would have ever made that derivation. So the Gemara says, okay, mechatos, we could have derived it from chatos. But the Gemara says, mala chatos shekein mechaperes al chayve krisis. Chatos is also unique. It's an atonement for liabilities to kares. And so the Gemara says, okay, me'asham, we could learn it from asham. And so we would have learned it, so you need the exclusion. But the Gemara still says, no, you wouldn't have learned it from asham, because mala asham, shekein kadshe kachim. Asham is a carbon that's kadshe kachim. It's holy of holies. That's not true of Karban Pesach. And the Gemara notes, mikula nami, and all these other sources we have, like the ola, the chatos, they're also shekein kadshe kachim. They're also kadshe kachim. So you would never have derived Karban Pesach from them. And so therefore, again, you don't need oso to exclude Karban Pesach. And so the Gemara goes back to its earlier answer, liolam keda'amrin meikara. Really, we'll go back to what we said earlier. Oso b'tzafon vein shochet b'tzafon. The oso is saying this one is slaughtered in the north, but the shochet, the person doing the shechita, does not need to be in the north. Now, what was the difficulty with that? With the kasha loch mid Rabbi Achia nafka. Now, you asked that isn't that already learned from Rabbi Achia's source that we mentioned above? And we will take a look at the shinuya nuschos. Again, the question was that mid Rabbi Achia nafka lon. We learn it out from Rabbi Achia. Hakamash malon shochet lo boit safon mekabel boit safon. What it's really teaching us is not the shochet part that we already know. It's teaching us that we can make an inference. The shochet, it's not required safon, but the mekabel, the person receiving the blood, does in fact need to be in the north. That's actually what Oso is teaching through that inference. Again, back in the Gemara, with the kasha lach mid Rabbi Achia nafkalon, you had a kasha that don't we learn it from Rabbi Achia? Lav lemuute shochet b'tzafon. It's not that we're excluding shochet b'tzafon, that we already know. Ella, rather you make the following inference: Ein shochet b'tzafon. The shochet doesn't need to be in the north. Aval mekabel b'tzafon, but the mekabel needs to be in the north. But the Gemara continues and asks on that, Mekabel, do we really need a source for the Mekabel? Mekabel mi lokach v'lokach nafka. Isn't Mekabel learned from lokach v'lokach? That's a reference to the drush on the previous summit that we learned v'lokach is lo yikach. He has to take himself. He has to be in the north himself. And the Gemara says to that, lokach v'lokach lo mashmalei. To this Tana, he doesn't darshan lokach v'lokach, and that's why he needs this source. And the Gemara continues and asks, Eshkechan shchita biyola lemitzvah, we find slaughtering by karbanola, that it should be in the north, that we find as a mitzvah lechatchila. And Kabbalah nami lemitzvah eshkechan, Kabbalah also we have a source of a mitzvah lechatchila, but shchita v'Kabbalah la'akev minol. And where do we have a source that the shchita and the Kabbalah, that it's ma'akev, that it has to be in the north, that it's required, and otherwise it's disqualified? And the Gemara says to that, Amar Ravada Barava, Ravada Barava says, Vitema Rava Bar Shela, and some say Rava Bar Shela says, Kal v'chomer, we make the following Kal v'chomer. Umachatas haba mikoach ola. If chatas is all, it's all learned from ola, the requirement of north. By chatas, the source is from ola. Ma'akevis, and there we find it's required, as we just said above. So ola sheba chatas mikocha, ola which chatas comes from it, eino din shema'akevis. Doesn't it make sense to say that it's absolutely required? But the Gemara says, Malachatas shekein mechaperes al chayve krisos. Maybe chatas is unique because it's mechaperes, it's an atonement for chayve krisos. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Ravina says, Hakashalei l'Ravada Barava. This was a difficulty to Ravada Barava. Klum matzinu tafel chamer minu ikr. Do you ever find a tafel that's stricter from the ikr? Meaning, the main source is ola, and chatas is a tafel that's derivative from ola. You never find the tafel is going to be stricter than the ikr, and so therefore it's obvious that ola also, it is going going to be required. But the Gemara says to that, Amar le Mar Zutra Breder Rav Mori l'Ravina, Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Mori, said to Ravina, V'lo, do we not find such a thing? And Rashi explains, Hakash alei, this is difficult to him. Kolomar, what it means to say is, Mehai tam, for the following reason, Dayik, Kal V'chomer Didei, he makes his Kal V'chomer. It's not really a kasha, it's just saying, regardless of the fact that a chatas is mechaperes on chayve krisus, but still, it's impossible not to make this Kal V'chomer, because we don't find that tafel chomer min ikr, that the tafel is stricter than the ikr, meaning lomad chomer min amalamid. We don't find the thing that's derived is stricter than the thing that's doing the teaching. Kigon chatas shaba mikoach ola, for example, if chatas is being learned from ola, the ikr tzafon ba'ola ksiv, because tzafon, the idea of north, is really written by ola, so it has to be that it's required by ola as well. You don't find that the tafel is stricter than the ikr, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph.